All right, welcome back to the last session of the afternoon. Before turning things over to Alfonso, I wanted to send out a word of encouragement to folks who are starting in about row 4 and back. We've had a vast majority of the questions from the front 3 rows, a huge majority from the front row. So I don't think it's because we're overlooking hands in the back, but if we are, wave them higher. And so I definitely want to encourage the students to ask questions. This is a great opportunity to engage Alfonso in one of his favorite activities, which is arguing with you. It's my great pleasure to introduce Alfonso, who, again, needs no introduction. As you know, he is one of the group of 4 who founded this workshop 10 years ago, this meeting 10 years ago. So we asked him on this occasion to give one of the talks. I learned something new about Alfonso at this meeting. Most people know that Lolly has a, name her friends call her, so not Lorraine, but Lolly. And I just learned at this meeting that Alfonso likes his friends to call him Alf. Alf, take it away.
I did not hear.
I just said you'd like your friends to call you Alf.
Oh, yes. I have to say that I don't know any senior person, and by senior I mean older person, who gets so much abuse. And you guys are lucky that I'm a nice fellow, and I don't get upset, but I do occasionally. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And I especially want to thank Sharon for not opposing my chance to speak today. I think I'm going to have a relatively short talk, which is unusual for me. Because I always sort of spend more time on the slides than I should. But the reason is that I would like to spend most of the time discussing with you some, I think, difficult questions that we keep on avoiding asking, and we keep on putting aside as if they would just go away if we stop asking those kinds of unpleasant questions. Fortunately, the speakers before me have done all this fantastic work, setting the stage so that many of the concepts I'm going to use now have already been discussed, and so I can go through some of these slides fairly quickly. Staying with the theme of the conference, my topic will be how we process object information, how we recognize objects, and how do we store object knowledge. Now, it turns out that my slides don't show what I have on my thing here. I don't know why. What it should have said is that this is an immensely complex problem that can be addressed at many levels. I don't know why one slide didn't come up. And you can see it by looking at this simple object. And this morning you heard many comments about what does it mean you represent an object. Well, here's an object, and you can analyze this at many different levels. And some of it has to do with the colors of the object, some of it to do with its shape, some of it to do with... and this object at one level representation is merely a ball. But if you're a baseball fan, this is not a ball. This is a Babe Ruth ball. This is something that is to be cherished. So there's all kinds of knowledge for those when we analyze objects that has to be represented somewhere, somehow, has to be in the system. And when we say that we have object recognition, of course the question is, what do we mean? Where is object recognition? Which kind of object recognition are you talking about? Are you talking about saying that this thing looks like a ball kind of thing? Are you saying this is a ball, it's a baseball? It is a baseball that is orthographed by someone that many Americans love and think very highly of and so on. So all of those levels of representation have to be addressed. Now, I'm not going to discuss, in fact, contrary to what some people might believe, I'm not going to talk about concepts, only because I have no idea what we're talking about when we talk about concepts. We have only very poorly worked out ideas about concepts. As in many other areas of cognitive science, of psychology, most of the detailed progress has been made at the periphery of the system. So a lot has been learned about early vision and so on. A lot has been learned about the motor system. And it's when we get closer to the higher levels that we start to have difficulties. In part, it's because of the complexity of the problem, but also in part for the lack of methods to be able to address these kinds of questions. So I'm going to this talk is going to be based on three widely shared theoretical empirical assumptions. The first one is that there are multiple levels of processing representation in processing an object. I think we all share this. You're familiar with these kinds of slides. In fact, someone may have used a similar slide from Poggio, and this I got from Gabriel Kreiman. Basically, the idea is that what we're doing is in processing information, we go through multiple levels, and then there's the hope that we're going to be able to characterize what those levels are. Okay, and that's where the difficulty arises, exactly where those levels. The classical view, which I think is probably going to turn out to be wrong, is that we have these very simple units, and these simple units are combined all the way up in a little bit more complex, and there are these simple units that are combined. And given my propensity for an evolutionary perspective on how the brain come to be about, perhaps that's not the way it is. Perhaps the levels actually represent bits of information is much more complex than the classical human and weasel view of how the world is organized. But that is something that is an empirical question to be solved. But in any case, certainly everyone agrees that there are multiple levels of representation. Now, the other shared assumption is that there is a distributed organization involving modalities and attribute types. So when you look at something like the ball, you can see it as a visual object, but if someone dropped it, you could hear the sound. If it's got a very heavy thud, you know that it's probably solid. So there are many kinds of information that you can have about the object, and those kinds of information are represented probably in different modality systems. And you can see this immediately by comparing three simple examples: fork, painting, and rainbow. They all have external reference, but they have different kinds of structure. So a fork not only has a visual representation, it is also a representation about how you use it. The fact that you grasp it, the fact that it can be used in a particular way, all of the information has to be integrated in getting to an understanding of the thing is a fork. Now, painting is like a fork in many respects, in that it is a physical object. There's something there that you can point to, but it's not a graspable object. Paintings are not the kind of stuff you grab, so the representation you have for paintings is going to be quite different, and will again involve different kinds of information probably represented in different parts of the brain. And rainbow, that's my favorite. Rainbow, again, that's beautiful. It's something you can look at. It's got colors, you perceive colors and so on, but you can't point to it. You can point it, you cannot touch it, you cannot pick it. It is something that is real and is unreal at the same time. You can't get your hands around it. Oop, that was South African accent came out. Once in a while, those accents come out. So this is another widely shared assumption, and there are many reasons for thinking that this idea of a distributed representational system for attributes is a reasonable one. Those of you who have worked in neuropsychology are familiar with the various types of dissociations from the agnosias and the apraxias. So you have disorders of motion perception, you have disorders of shape perception, but not motion perception. You have disorders of color perception, but not shape perception, and you have disorders of action, and these are particularly exciting. And I'll just give you an example where by action clearly is a very complicated notion that spans all the way from the motoric elements to things like goals and intentions and for the action you're performing, but also the functional aspects of the object. And here is Here's an example from a paper that I like very much by Laura Boxbaum and her collaborators, where they studied the patient. WC in say, they did many experiments. It's a beautiful paper, many tasks, but compare the performance in matching pictures by manner of manipulation. So you have to decide which of these three go together in terms of the ways in which you manipulate or you interact with the object, versus matching pictures by function, which of these three objects have the same function. Okay. And the patient is supposed to say, pick these two or these two, depending on the characteristic, on the question you're asking. Well, the patient was basically a chance on the motor part and essentially perfect on the function part. So you know that at this point, this tells you that the ways in which you represent information about a knowledge of objects has to be dissociated into parts. One part of the brain, or however the brain does it, is going to be concerned with a more abstract representation of action, and in this case of function, and the other part may be more tied to the specific motor sequence associated in accomplishing the function. This problem, I'll come back to it in a moment, is responsible for me interacting with Alex Martin. So I'll come to that later.
Manner of manipulation.
I beg your pardon?
Manner of manipulation.
That's right. Okay. The third shared assumption that I think I'm going to use is that there seems to be an organization by object category or domain in the brain. And one of the main empirical generalizations to emerge from neuroimaging and neuropsychological research seems to be that. This I think, certainly for me, it was a surprise that the brain organized itself in such a way that domain was a dimension in which. Now, many of you are young and you almost take it for granted because you've been brought up to read these papers where everyone talks about categories and so on, but it wasn't so from the beginning. And this kind of organization is true, as I'll come in a moment, in neuropsychological literature, but also in the imaging literature. You saw the slide earlier today. Lolly showed the slide where there are these bizarre results. That it looks like one part of the brain likes certain objects more than it likes others. And it's not obvious why that should be the case. And this is the work that Alex Martin and his many collaborators have worked on. And this is perhaps even more familiar work of Nancy Kenwish and her associates. Can people see the slide? It looks, to me, doesn't look at all. In any case, you're familiar with this. Blue is faces, green is bodies, and pink is places. And what has been shown is that there are category preferences in different parts of the brain. And the category preferences seem to be not a single preference. It can be distributed in different parts of the brain, perhaps reflecting the fact that, as we were saying earlier, and everyone believes, that there are multiple levels of representation in addressing an object. I should say that my entry point into these kinds of issues is not from the imaging literature. My entry point is from cognitive neuropsychology, and I'll say so in a moment. And the cognitive neuropsychology approach has been particularly fruitful, at least for me. And just when I give you an historical aside, this is in a paper, it came in a book by Konorski, and those of you who are familiar with the many writings by Charlie Gross, who loves the history of neuroscience, he wrote a whole paper on Konorski, and in his various writings he refers to Konorski. And Konorski already in 1967 was talking about an organization in visual cortex, or whatever visual means, in visual cortex by types of categories. So manipulable objects, big objects of various sorts, faces and people and animals and writing and body parts. He got it right before anyone even did the imaging. And this was based on his observations of patients. There were no detailed analyses, but certainly already the idea that there might be an organization associated or determined by domain was already certainly in the neuropsychology literature. Well, one of the events that was important for me was the papers by Elizabeth Warrington and Tim Challis and Rose McCarthy, who in the early 80s, late 70s, reported a number of patients who showed what came to be called category-specific semantic deficits. And of course, that, I don't know why they were called category-specific semantic deficits, but it's ambiguous. You don't know if it means they're category-specific semantic deficits, or if they meant that they are category semantic deficits. So it's not clear whether they meant which is the semantic category is damaged, or whether the deficit is a semantic deficit. Well, it turns out that the debate is still going on because you probably have both. This led to a very important proposal. It was used to argue for the importance of modality, and it was done so because if you look at the kinds of deficits that they observed, they had bizarre combinations. Patients were impaired with living things and foods. Foods are man-made, they're artifacts, they are manufactured, and they have nothing to do with living things. Non-living things were relatively spared. And so they resorted to the assumption, and this is very interesting, a historical footnote, those of you who don't know this. Originally, Elizabeth Warrington wanted to argue for category deficits. But then she convinced herself, and I don't know if the fault is my friend, the person to blame is my friend Tim, but then she convinced herself that she should adopt a different approach, and that is to argue that there is no category organization, but rather it is a modality organization that has as a reflex what looks like a category deficit. Well, I don't want to go into that issue. I'm happy to discuss it later if people have an interest. But a few years later, and this is where I changed my mind about a number of things. Jenny Shelton in my lab, David Kaplan had referred a patient to us to study language, but when we tested the patient, we didn't see anything interesting in language, but we discovered that the patient just couldn't name animals. She was just completely at a loss for animals. And so we found a patient who had severely impaired in processing animals in all different ways. And that contrasts with patients who don't have difficulties with animals, but have difficulties with artifacts. And that's led me to, so the first reason why I became interested in this issue led me to change my mind about the basis for these kinds of deficits. And I formulated what I called at the time domain-specific hypothesis. And this hypothesis makes a very strong but simple claim. What it says is that the existence of these kinds of highly selective deficits by domain reflect the fact that the brain is organized into systems, and these systems are built in. They're not things that are acquired, they're not learned. The brain comes already predisposed to organize information in a particular way, and that's because of the evolutionary pressures we have all had in recognizing what's around us in the world. And that if that were the case, if it were true that the brain is not just this general purpose machine, but is a machine that has high specializations, not only in terms of low-level processing properties, but already for high-level domain-type things, then as a consequence, you're going to end up having category-specific deficits or domain-specific deficits. But the domains in question would be precisely and only those that can be given a characterization in evolutionary terms. And thus you have to be able to argue that the brain evolved to be able to process information in a particular way, and therefore neural structures were developed for this. And the obvious candidate domains or living animate domain, conspecifics, of course, naturally occurring food domain, possibly tools, numerosity, navigation, a number of things that we know have to have been part in the evolution of species. Okay, so given these observations, the domain-specific hypothesis makes the assumption that there are specialized neural mechanisms for processing different domains of objects and different types of attributes. So both are specialized, and both are determined in evolutionary terms. Okay, so things live in the brain where they do because that's what the brain was designed to do. Okay, they're not there because you learn. It's not that you wake up one morning, you're bored, you open your eyes, and you're just saying, okay, well, fine, there are faces over there. Let's put faces here. Oh, they are, okay. No, the brain knows exactly what to do with the stuff from day one. The second thing is that the question is what information is represented in domain-specific areas. Now, we say that there are multiple levels of representation, so obviously this question is silly unless we say at which level the information is represented. And so the question specifically I will be talking about is what information is represented at those levels of representation that we can think of as being domain-specific. And of course, the other question is what drives the organization, and I've already said what I think, but I'll try and defend it. So one implication of this is that if it were true that if it's true that the structure and organization of these mechanisms in the brain is evolutionarily determined, and I take it to be an accepted fact in biology, it's not something that we need to discuss. An implication is that this structure should be largely immune to experience. That is, experience should not especially affect the structure. And I'll explain what I mean in more detail this in a moment. Now, the second reason for doing this kind of work, the thing that drove me into this area, is having had a number of discussions together with Alex Martin and Brad Mahon, and Alex kept on saying these things, strange things about function, and we kept on arguing, what is function, and I thought he meant by function, or he was talking about function in very motoric kind of ways, and I was getting upset that he kept on saying this, and I remember exactly the exact words almost I used. I said, well, what is the function of epaulets? Okay, that you point to it? I mean, the epaulets have functions, but certainly they don't have a motor function. Well, perhaps you have to put them on at some point, but that's not the function of epaulets. And so we designed an experiment together, and Brad, Alex, and I, and that's how I started learning something about neuroimaging. Unfortunately, I'm a very poor student, and so I haven't learned very much about neuroimaging, but I can fake it. And I try to in any case. And then, of course, there turn out to be really strong empirical observations that seem to suggest that the animate-inanimate distinction is truly a robust distinction in the brain. It keeps coming up all the time. It's been shown in the studies that you've all seen about earlier this morning by Kriegerskorte, Chiani, many other people. And there was a paper just recently by Huth and from Galland's lab, a huge paper in Nature Neuroscience. I understood not a word, except that they said that the major distinction to come out was animate-inanimate. But then I didn't know what else it was. Anyway, I don't know if anyone read that paper. It's really a hard paper to read. I couldn't figure it out. Okay. But in any case, at least we know that even with those complicated methods, you still get the animate-inanimate distinction to come out. Now, as I said, I wanted to start doing some work in this area, and I'm going to talk about just a couple of things in this area, only to make a point. And so there are many studies, and I apologize, I don't discuss everybody's work, and I just want to look at a couple of results to try and make a point. Okay. Well, one result is a project with one of my former postdocs, Talia Konko, She had previously shown with Odoliva that the size of objects is relevant, and that big objects are representing one part of the brain, and small objects a different part of the brain. And when she told me that size was important, I said that's not possible, it's wrong, and you did something wrong. And when data disagrees with my theories, it can't be right. And as you become older as a professor, that is more and more true. And so we designed an experiment that actually had size crossed with animacy, animate objects, and what we found was that in fact there is a tripartite organization with animate inanimate. So to look at this slide, the blue is large objects, big objects. The orange is small artifacts. These are all artifacts, and these are animals. And what you can see is size is totally irrelevant for animate things. So if you're a spider or you're an elephant, you're an animal. Makes no difference. Okay, and this again, I think, is very strong, again, the confirmation for the basic nature of something being animate. But it does make a difference if you're an artifact. So if you're big, then you process preferentially in this part of the brain, in the blue parts, and if you're small, you process preferentially in this part of the brain. Okay? So it looks like we can conclude that size is not a general organizing principle. It can be. It's not relevant for animals, but it may be fundamental for inanimate objects. Well, it turns out that perhaps that's too strong a claim, and the issue is that size, not size, but only for inanimate objects, and together with Talia and a graduate student in my lab, Caterina Magri, formerly from the CIMEC, we did a small study where we looked at small objects, artifacts, and large artifacts, and then we tried to pick them in such a way that some of the small artifacts were what we've called motor relevant, motor relevant and non-motor relevant. So I don't know. So a vase is not. There's no motor organization around that object, whereas for tweezers and corkscrews and so on, the motor component is very important. And then large objects, again, the same thing. And what Caterina found is that she perhaps found. Okay. What should I say? Yeah? Now, let me see if this... I knew Alex was involved in this, and I saw him messing around with my computer here, and I didn't know what he was doing. Okay. You need help? I need help. No, I don't need help. Well, I need help, but not that kind. So let me see. You know, something interesting happens as you get older. You think you remember things, you don't. If I were to start again, I would give a totally different talk. So just don't push it, okay? Okay, it worked. So what she found is something I think quite beautiful, namely that this is the univariate analysis, and she showed the multivariate. I'm not going to go into any of those details. What she found is that in the area LOC, the one that we chose in the orange, if you remember, that there's a big response for small manipulable motor objects. And there's no difference really between small non-motor and large motor, and not very much difference either from large non-motor. So it looks like that LOC just likes small things that are manipulable. It just doesn't like other things. And if you look at the PPA, and this is pretty much what other people have shown previously, large non-motor are the strongest response. The scale is it's misleading, and this is a much stronger response than these, but relatively that's what I'm referring to. So here you have a clearly strong response to large non-motor. and there's really not much difference between large motor and small non-motor. So it looks like it's a very complicated interaction going here, but I think you get a better appreciation for this by looking at the individual item responses. That, I think, captures very nicely what is going on. And what you can see is that in LOC, oh, I forgot I had this. What you can see in LOC, the small motor items, they're all up here, pretty much, right? And the small non-motor, they're all over the place, including all the way down here. There's nothing special about smallness in this sense. And if you look at the PPA, again, you get that the big items tend to be here, but not all of them. There's also some big items here. And the question is, what is it about the ones that are in these different places? So here are some of them, a swing set, a piano, what is this? What do you call it? Xylophone? No? Is what you call it? Xylophone? Okay. This is another one of those musical instruments. And then over here at the end, you get very big objects like motorcycles, bicycles, cars. Okay. So really, what is going on here is not motor relevance in this system. It's something else. What's going on here is, as some other people have already shown, people like Russ, including Russ Epstein, but I forget the names of the English group, British group, have shown that permanence or stability, being in place, is fundamental in activating this area. So what we have to do, really, we have to change the characterization of these areas. What these are large navigation-relevant objects, and what these are small manipulable objects. There's not size, qua-size, okay? So it's not size in itself, okay? But rather it is size when combined with other features that define the object. Okay? And I think that part of the problem that we've had is something that Alan Newell, many years ago, wrote this beautiful paper on playing 20 questions with nature. The psychologists have this propensity for asking a binary question, is it A or B? And we spend 10 years doing that, and we say, well, it's not A or B, it's something else. And then we say, okay, well, is it C or D? And we keep on going around this, rather than trying to come up with an articulated theory of why any one feature would be important. How is it that it integrates with other kinds of information? And I think that the answer here is that size is not an organizing principle. However, size is computationally relevant for artifacts. The size is not an irrelevant feature. You cannot grasp a refrigerator with your hand. And so the size of an object is important determinant for how you interact with it, but it's only one visual feature, among others, that serves to distinguish the domain animate, manipulable objects, and navigation-relevant objects. And I'll come back to this at the end of this presentation. Okay. So, given this background, then, given this thing, we can ask, what is represented in these seemingly domain and modality-specific regions? And why is it organized this way? Why is it organized this way? What principles drive this organization? The why question is something people usually, we tell students, you don't ask the why question, you should ask how. I think the why questions are the most important questions when it comes to the brain. And so why is it organized this way? And So the first question is, what is represented? Is it conceptual or perceptual level representations? And that's what Lolly's talk today. I'm just simply going to show one experiment that Marius did. I'm very lucky. I have all of these great collaborators who are brilliant, and it's so easy to do good work when they do it. With Marius, when we first met many years ago now, we thought that a cool question was what is represented in the brain, so this is the experiment we came up with, and this is we looked at different kinds of objects, objects like these, like this. These are kitchen versus garage type objects, workshop items, and and then these involve one particular kind of motor pattern, and this involve a different kind of motor pattern to accomplish the function. So these are important or function-relevant attributes of these objects, but nonetheless, they are motorically represented kinds of representations. And the question was, how is this information represented and where is it represented? And I'm not going into detail. There's been all of this discussion about the use of this technique today. We've heard many presentations, so everyone is familiar with this. But basically what we wanted to know was whether the response pattern, the neural response pattern for these objects was more similar to these than it might be to these, because these are both kitchen items, say, and whether this is more similar to this than this or this is to this, because these both involve a particular kind of motor action. And normally, so you can look at same context, different context, same action, different context, and different context. And so there are three dimensions of similarity that you can look at. You can look at conceptual similarity, and I put conceptual similarity in parentheses because I have no idea what I'm talking about. I mean, what we can say is that the similarity having to do with how you use those objects and where you find them. To call it conceptual is a stretch, but it's conceptual-like, let's say. Or it could be conceptual, or at some level is conceptual. Okay. But there may also be non-conceptual characteristics associated with those objects. The second is perceptual similarity, what things look like, and then where this is defined behaviorally, subjects are asked to rate how similar two things are. And so it's a global measure of similarity, it's not a measure of specific visual features. And the pixel-wise similarity, this is just overlapping the figures and seeing. And what was found is looking at so-called conceptual information, perceptual information, and pixel-wise information, and looking at different parts of the brain from the back to the front, right? You can see that. What you see is that pixel-wise information is represented primarily in early visual areas. Conceptual type information is represented primarily in anterior areas, and this will make perhaps Lolly happy. And importantly, perceptual information is represented around areas in occipital-temporal cortex. Okay. So what this area represents, I'm going to argue, and there's lots of data along these lines, and we can discuss what it might mean, is that in the area where we are finding domain preferring responses, in that same area, the dimension of relevance is not conceptual, but perceptual. Okay, this is the only point I'm trying to make here, and of course there are other clever ways of doing this. You can use whole brain search analysis, and the same areas come up, so that the conceptual, I cannot read. The perceptual representations, information is right here, and a whole brain analysis again. So this essentially replicates the ROI analysis. So, so what can we conclude, or at least one possible conclusion? And this could be completely wrong, but on the basis of these kinds of data and similar data, the temporal occipital area represents visual form information, and not information about the action pattern or location associated with an object. And this gets back to the question we're discussing today, whether in fact in these areas you also have semantic information of a different sort. And those who would claim so would have to tell me what they mean by semantic information of different sorts in this area, and what the theory would look like. Note, I should say, I put visual in scare quotes, and I want to point out that around that area, you also have results like those by Amir Ahmedi and others, that parts of this area respond not only to visually presented tools, but to tools presented tactilely. So if you present something, subject palpate those objects, there's no visual input, that area gets also activated. Okay, so that's the first observation. The second question is, how am I doing on time, Karen? Do I have an hour still?
You have about 6 minutes.
No, you're lying. Then you're joking. Okay, all right, then I did go much slower than I thought. So the question is, why is it organized this way, and what principles drive this organization? And this is where, in large in response to a paper that Lolly Tyler wrote, where she accused, in a little paper that Brad and I wrote in TICS, she accused us of writing Kipling stories. And those of you who don't know about Kipling, is sort of, the just so stories about how a giraffe got to have a long neck and so on. And she says that what Brad and I were engaging in was this evolutionary mumbo jumbo just so stories. And so we wrote back and said, well, yeah, it may be so, but we're just struggling, but we're trying to do something. However, it makes one surprising prediction. What it says is that if you look at a congenitally blind individual and you test the individual with objects that have the characteristics of being animate or inanimate and having these kinds of properties, then you should get the brain to respond to those things the way sighted people do. Well, it's not. The story is a little bit more complicated. So this was the response to Lolly, and she never wrote to me after that. Said, "Well, okay." And so Brad's thesis, it took us years and years and years, and then finally, after 8 years of working or something, he managed to test 3 subjects. It was very hard to find congenitally blind individuals in Italy, and so at least we couldn't find them. And so the interesting result was, and this is a bad slide, I apologize, but I just want to get you to look at this, okay? See this function. This is going from lateral to medial, medial to lateral, and this is in sighted individuals looking at pictures. Sighted individuals looking at pictures, sighted individual in the auditory task, they hear the word, I don't know, refrigerator, whatever. Okay? And this is congenitally blind, of course, in this case was auditory because they're blind. And in all cases, what you see is this sort of preference in one part of the brain for artifacts of inanimate things. Okay. Now, since then, thanks to Yan Xiaobi and Mario Spilin and many other colleagues in China primarily, we've been able to look at this in more detail, and this is the response you get to large objects. And this is, again, I think much clearer now. This is about 16 subjects congenitally blind, so it's no longer, we can really do fancy analysis. They can do fancy analysis, and what you see is this is sighted auditory task, blind auditory, and sighted visual, and the patterns are essentially identical. Okay? It makes no difference whether you're blind or not. It makes no difference whether you see the picture of the object or whether you hear the name of the object. Okay? And you can do this again, another study, now this one looking at small objects, and the 3 groups, this is blind, I cannot see, my eyes are going, blind auditory, can people read that? Yeah, okay, sighted auditory and sighted visual. And it's just scary. I mean, sometimes I don't believe data that is so good. Usually I'm skeptical. These things are overlapping, almost completely overlapping. So whatever is going on is. So I think that we can conclude from this. I'm going to be a few minutes late. I'm sorry, because I spent too much time joking. I'll try and. So what it is saying is you get domain specificity without visual experience. Okay, that is important, I think. That is something. It's a fact. If we haven't made a mistake, right? I mean, grant. If we've done everything wrong, of course, then it's nonsense. But assuming we haven't done something wrong, then this is a tremendously important fact. What it's saying is that what we've been looking at, as saying that something is visual, whatever that means, that specialization of those areas for visual information cannot have been strictly or only because of the visual nature of the object. Okay? So but there's an interesting wrinkle to every story, and there's one to the story too. And I don't know if everyone will be able to follow it, but not because you're not able to follow it, but because I don't know if I can explain it properly. But what we've done, again, with B and Wong and Marius and a number of other people, the largest study with many more objects, we looked at something that I'm always amazed that it works. So this is a between-group connectivity pattern. One of the results I did not mention is that if you look at the blind and the sighted, the connectivity pattern from the sights, areas of interest in the blind and the sighted are the same. It's just amazing. Okay? Now, so this is a correlation between group connectivity pattern similarities. For each voxel, you ask for the sighted and the blind, is the connectivity pattern for that voxel the same? And the correlation is pretty good. There it is. Okay? But note where the high correlations are and where the low correlations are. The high correlations are right here, and not here. Okay? I'll come back to this in a moment. So this is the correlation between group category for activation patterns. So this is just what we've been talking about, the activation pattern, say, to a refrigerator or to a hammer. And again, look where the high correlations are and where the low correlations are. And this is the correlation between these two. And as you can see, it's the Bayesian correlation, it's 0.56. You can do this also. We've just looked at between group category activation patterns. You can do between modality category activation patterns. This is important. So to ask in the sighted, when I give you the word or I give you the picture, how correlated are those responses? And look where they are highly correlated, and look where the correlation is low. And this correlates with this, again, very high. Okay? So I think that what we can conclude, this is the three things together, what we can conclude is that domain response cortex is not uniformly unimodal. What this is saying is that if we look at the areas of the brain we've been talking about as if it was this sort of homogeneous kind of stuff, it isn't. Okay? At least it isn't, even in the sighted when you use different kinds of stimuli. Okay? So we have to rethink about what it is that we represent in these areas. So what do we make of this wrinkle in the story? So the idea is that domain interacts in a way that is very revealing for the factors that drive the organization of this part of the brain. Okay? So the selectivity for manipulable objects and seen domains is largely immune to visual deprivation and is supramodal. I use supra so that I don't offend anybody. It's not trans, it's not cross, it's not whatever, it's supra, whatever that means. Okay? So I don't want to get into an argument. So while selective animate items in lateral posterior fusiform is present only with visual stimulation. Visual stimulation, okay? So a conjecture, and you can see this in the paper that Yan Chao. That's the author list is wrong. It says I picked an old slide. It's B, Wong, and Caramazza. Sorry, B. You can ask it. The details is right here, B. The conjecture is that these effects reflect a distinction between the visual features that characterize different object domains and their interaction with different types of downstream computational systems. Specifically, feature-based or part-based object-directed action. And I'll come back to this idea of connectivity downstream in a moment. No, I'm finishing. I'm done. Okay. So let me show you the last two slides. You don't need vision. Do you need motor to explain why the hand area is where it is and it interacts with tools, and there are these individuals, dysplasics, who are born without limbs, so they have no motor experience with hands. And as you know, Stefania Bracci, who's here, has done all these beautiful studies with Marius, looking at this area of overlap between hands and tools. And this was found in I think, 13 or 14 subjects, some incredibly large number, that the area that responded to hands also responded to tools. And what happens when you ask people who have no hands? Okay? Will they develop this specialization also. And Ella Stream-Amit and Gilles Van Ouscourt were both here, and they have posters, and you should go to the poster by Stream to get the details. You find that this hand tool overlap develops also in people who have no hands and therefore couldn't have had any motor experience to drive this organization. So, finished, 4 questions, and I'll give you the answers. How is object knowledge organized in the brain? Organization is both by domain and attributes. What is represented in these distributed regions? We can distinguish conceptual from modality-specific representations, but their nature remains elusive. What forces led to this organization? Domain organization directly reflects development of mechanisms specialized for processing of evolutionarily important object types, animate objects, navigation tools. And what about this particular organization? And the areas live with the live because of a complex trade-off of 2 pressures, different pressures. Some expressed locally within a brain region, and some expressed as connectivity constraints. That is, if you have a kind of information you have to process in a particular way, then you better put it in the brain in a place that can communicate with what other things are going to do with it. Okay? And there's not much real estate. If I build a house here, I cannot build a different house here, right? Once I've built my house here, then it's stuck. Okay? And that's why the brain is so rigid, and that's why experience only modulates at the margins what evolution has set. And thank you very much. This is the final thoughts I had, and I'll be happy to discuss them. But basically, there's one fundamental conclusion, and that is that the reason things are where they are is because of optimal computational efficiency, or what Brad and I call the connectivity constraint principle. It's you're there because that's where you can process information. And this are all the wonderful people who did all the work, and I thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I knew it.
From the second row, Alex.
Just a point of clarification. There was something I just missed about this distinction between a lateral and medial fusiform that had to do with the connectivity and the consistency. Just please tell us again, because it sounded very important.
When people ask polite questions, I get nervous. They're setting you up. Okay. All right, Alex. This is the between group connectivity pattern similarity. So this is, we look at the sighted and at the blind, and you ask, this voxel is connected with what? And you look at what is connected, and then you correlate, you average across individuals in the group, and then you correlate, and you ask, is the functional connectivity, resting state functional connectivity for this voxel the same in the sighted and the blind? And the answer is yes. The correlation is very high here. You can see it, and it's very high here, and it's low. Resting state functional connectivity. Okay, resting state. Okay, this is not a resting state. This is actual task performance. And now you're asking between group category activation patterns, and you find the same general configuration. It's very strong here, it's strong here, and here it's weak. Okay. You look at these two correlations. You correlate these two, and that's pretty cool. Okay. So that is what I was showing. So I was trying to draw your attention to the strikingly low correlations in the animate area, the area that typically shows up as animate. And this was between modalities. So now in the sighted, I asked them. We looked at the correlation in response, task responses for the word stimulus and the picture stimulus. And you can see that these correlations are really high here, but they are really very bad there. Okay, and this is a paper that Wong et al. Just published. You sound like Elizabeth Warrington. When I had this discussion, one of the came to me, she looked at me, she says, the data speak for themselves.
Yeah.
I don't know what do you mean they speak for themselves. I mean, in what language? Yeah, compelling. Yeah, I recommend that people go speak with B, Marius, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you, Alfonso. Very nice talk. I have a quick question. Did I get it right that all the big objects that you call environment navigation objects were mostly musical instruments?
I beg your pardon, all the ones that were?
Most of the big navigation environment navigation objects were musical instruments?
No, I was just showing you, I mean, the reason I pointed to the musical instruments to show you that even though they're very strong in motor relevance, right? Because xylophone you have motor. It's not the motor element that is the manipulation dimension that is important.
But so, why are they like strongly represented in the PPA, musical instruments?
Let me go to the data so I can show you.
I'm talking about Katerina's study.
Yes, I know. Here it is. Okay. So we ordered them from the largest response to the smallest response in LOC, and this is in the PPA, okay? And the question is, how important is motor relevance? Now, of course, motor relevance is an ambiguous term. It's a terrible term. In fact, it's bad. And if you measure motor relevance, how much you're involved in something motorically, then a xylophone is, right? It's very motor relevant. You have to move your arms and so on, right? And if you are so the piano is the same thing, right? You have to use your fingers, but what happened was that those objects actually that the PPA likes them, okay? And that's because not because they're motor relevant, whatever that means, but because they're fixed. Okay, swing sets are there, they don't move around. They're landmarks, if you will. They can serve as landmarks. And the ways in which you interact with them, if you want to move around and navigate, is by moving your whole body around them, not by manipulating. Okay? But if you look then at the other end, you have big objects for which there's no response in PPA, essentially. And that there are things like bicycles, and things like bicycles, and I don't know what this thing is called, motorcycles, things that are don't stay in place, they move about. Okay, and this has already been shown by other people. Okay, what was important for me in particular was the question of LOC, and that is that it's not just size. Size is important, but it has to be size of interacting with other features of the object. Okay, and if people ask me the question, then I will answer it. So the question is, what are the features? What are the characteristics? I didn't set that up to ask them the question, by the way. So here, what relationship is there between domain preference and information represented? And this is a fundamental question. And there has been, I think, what I think is the way we should think about it is that it's information in the system that reflects statistically relevant clues to channel information to appropriate mechanisms. What is important is what statistical properties are in the signal such that the brain can exploit it to accomplish whatever it's trying to do. Okay? Those things are not conceptual. They have nothing to do with concepts. They're the kinds of stuff that it's a curvature. Okay, it is perhaps it perhaps involves. This is from Grill Spector. Okay, there are properties like eccentricity bias. Why? Because you tend to foveate some kinds of things. And again, if you're small, you're going to foveate more than if it's a big. I mean, there are a bunch of things that together move something somewhere. Okay, and the question is, why do they move there? They move there because of this optimality computational efficiency, and that is what Brett and I called connectivity constraint principle. You move there because that's where the information can be used efficiently, right? But what is the information? Well, it better be the kind of information that the visual system knows. Vision as a language If you speak to it in Turkish, it's not going to understand you. You have to speak to it in Italian. So, or another Italian, and a Romance language. I mean, it has to be the case that you have to have the information of a sort. And that is not conceptual information. It has a conceptual reflex, that is, it can be used to then compute something. Okay. So I think the misguided way in which we've been dealing with this problem, asking is it conceptual or not, is being that we really haven't defined what we mean by conceptual, okay? And we haven't defined what we mean by visual. Okay? And so we can have this loose talk. But now there are some really smart people doing this work. There's a fellow by the name of Madhavan at Harvard who is able to actually categorize objects as small manipulable objects, animals, and large stationary objects strictly on the basis of some computational characteristics model of the visual characteristics of the objects. Okay? So does this mean then that we have to abandon the notion of domain? To the contrary, this is reinforcing the original idea I think we proposed, that this is an evolutionarily determined process. And if it is so, it's not going to be conceptual. It's going to be based on the statistical regularities of the physical world. The other aspect to emphasize here is that the environment of humans is incredibly complex. And by environment, I mean the kind of stuff in the world out there that we, as an organism, can process and interact with. And that is a vastly complex set of things. So whatever features you're going to extract, it has to be sufficiently relaxed to allow for multiple kinds of things to be processed. Okay? So it's not that there's only one response to one stimulus, like say a frog, then anything that moves, and okay, my tongue shoots out. Okay? This is much, much more complex, and therefore the representations themselves have to be correspondingly complex. Okay? That doesn't make them conceptual at all, and that I think has been the misguided argument that's come from the embodied cognition people who have tried to say that it's conceptual because it's domain related. No, it isn't. Domain related doesn't mean conceptual. Sorry for this long answer.
Thank you. Oh dear, this is inevitable. You didn't present any data at all that I could understand as being evidence against conceptual representations or conceptual information in the fusiform, right? You looked at visual properties, and you looked at motion or size or something or another.
Right.
And okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that...
May I forget things. May I answer?
No,
do you mind?
Write them down. No, I might forget them.
Okay, all right. Okay, I'm going to write it down then.
And the other thing is that, you are selecting the attributes that you look at. You are not testing to see what the attributes are. And the third thing was that I didn't understand whether the people who had no hands were also blind. If they weren't, sorry, it's not meant to be a joke, right? But if they weren't, then I don't see why you can't propose that you just have another modality of input. And given that I'm somebody who's subscribed to both input modality and conceptual effects in the fusiform, it would be fine.
Right.
It would be fine.
May I answer in reverse order because
Yes.
I forget, and also because I like the third question. You're absolutely right, and in a presentation of this sort, you don't make fine details. I should have been very careful to the way I formulated, which was to say that any one single modality or model system is not necessary. I should have said, okay, and that's what the data show. Okay? Now, why did I talk at all about it? And that's because there has been this misconception that that an area becomes specialized for something because of current ontogenetic experience. Okay? And what I wanted to argue is that no, it is not current ontogenetic experience that is relevant, but it's evolutionary experience. Okay? That is, this area is specialized in processing information in a particular way from the get-go, when you're bored, right? And you don't need the actual experience every time for it. Okay, now, of course, this doesn't mean that there's no plasticity. I don't want to get into all those discussions. But it begs the question when you say, well, it's just there. I mean, why is it there? It's there because of, and you have to give a reason for it, okay? And what I'm saying is that even if you take away the motor experience, okay, the ontogenetic, my personal motor experience, okay, it doesn't mean I'm taking away the possibility for the area to develop. Now, of course, you say, well, fine, that's developed because of visual experience alone. And that's perfectly fine also. I have no problem with that. Then, of course, then the question is, then why do hands and tools overlap? Okay, you have to come up with an explanation with that. So what I'm saying is that when you take seriously some of these results and you think about all of them into a picture, the degrees of freedom disappear very quickly. Okay, and so this is not. You're right. I mean, the ideal the ideal experiment, you find someone who's blind and doesn't have arms, and then you ask what happens there. But that's asking for miracles.
No, I meant that if the person who didn't have arms could see.
Yes, they could.
Right. Then you've got visual input.
Right.
What you would have a lack of
right.
is a particular kind of
right.
tactile
right.
experience
right.
that would be part of your
right.
developing conceptual representations.
Right. The right? Subtext. I'm sorry. This is really. I'm not doing justice to all of the beautiful ways people are doing. The subtext there is that. You need motor experience to get this area to develop. So I was saying, why do hands and tools go in the same place? They go there because you've experienced hands and tools. You, Lolitala, has experienced hands and tools. Okay, and then this area becomes specialized for hands and tools. Okay, and what the data show is that neither one of them is necessary. Okay, neither one of them is necessary. Okay. It is sufficient what you can say is that one of them is sufficient, either vision or motor experience is sufficient, and we don't have the experiment for both tested. But I don't care. I think the story is so good that, in other words, if you think of it in the context of a concrete proposal, okay, the question is, do we have a better story for this?
Well,
and so at this point, there is no other story.
Okay, it's a lovely story,
Thank
but
you.
I think
next.
I think it's inconsistent with a lot of data, which shows that there are many, many organizational principles in the ventral stream, in the fusiform, LOC, whatever you want to call it. And I think that we don't understand.
Such as, could you list some, please?
Well, I don't want to give my talk again, Alfonso.
Well, I tried to put here, this is a beautiful review by Gil Spector. I mean, she went through and actually sort of tried to show, some of the dimensions that, she doesn't have curvature. Curvature should have been here, is a very important dimension one could have pointed to. There are a whole bunch of features that people have tried to look at. And as you can see, how do we get this organization? Well, it turns out that this correlates with eccentricity. So is it domain? No, it's eccentricity. It correlates with size. Is it size? Is it domain? No, it's size. I mean, you can appeal to those things individually. The point is, can you come up with a coherent story that accounts for all of those things?
Yes,
and,
is my answer.
Well, okay.
But I'll pass on.
So I find myself very puzzled because I keep agreeing with things you're saying. But
there's something, she said this already a year ago, and I was really worried what was going on there.
But so I think the one thing that I just don't, maybe I found something I don't agree with, or I don't quite understand, is why you keep saying you think it's immune to experience. So you think this is a region that's very sensitive to the statistical properties of the input, and it's specialized for processing this kind of complex input, but immune to experience. But your experience changes what the statistics are for you. So
right. Okay. How can I say this? I use the word immune to experience, meaning that even if, for example, you don't see, you still get this organization. Even if you don't have arms, you still get this organization. Okay.
It's sensitive to your experience.
Sorry?
To me, that shows that it's sensitive to experience, not immune to experience, because their experiences are so different.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, yeah, but you're saying the same thing I'm saying. Then it's just a different way of framing it. I mean, if you're saying what this shows is that stuff is there no matter what we experience, and whatever we have to have some experience to have knowledge. I'm not going to be able to know what a hammer is unless I've had some experience. I mean, what is a hammer? So what I meant is a specific sensory motor experience. Okay, that specific sensory motor experience is not necessary in this part of the brain, right? So the question is, I have an area that is domain sensitive. Everyone seems to agree that there is such sensitivity, so not dispute. Then the question, why is it like that? Okay, and how did it get to be that way? And there are many possibilities. I mean, my friend Marge Livingston goes around saying that she has data that this confirms this theory, because she tested monkeys and she found that they were trained to recognize letter-like objects that mapped onto quantities, and she says, and she found that the specializations in these monkeys tended to show an organization such that the monkeys learned to associate the letter L shape, say, with 50. No, I'm joking. Those of you who know the Roman system. Anyway, L with say 2. Okay, and she says, well, okay, this shows that these areas develop because of the experience you have. And that's totally wrong. I mean, because if you look at the data, what she shows is that there are certain shapes that go in only one place. And the ones that go in this other place are the curvy objects. And then if you look at where the face stimuli go, they go in that area. So in fact, she has an ordering that is absolutely replicated in every monkey. And it's replicated independently of the order of the experience. You can train them first on the straight-edged letters or the curved letters. Makes no difference. The organization comes out the same. So what this is saying, I think, is that even at the neurophysiological level, experience, yes, of course, we know things because we have experience. I mean, I'm not saying we don't have. I'm not yet getting to the point of thinking like Fodor, okay, that concepts are innate. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that the machinery that allows you to get and process the information is much more rigid than we've always argued. It is much, much more rigid. And it's because of that rigidity that we get these particular patterns to appear over and over again. I mean, I showed you the slide by Nancy Kanwisher. I don't know if you saw it. Those were 3 different subjects. And if you look at those patterns, I mean, you could just overlap one on top of the other. And I showed you the data from B and Wong and Marius on the correlations across these different types of things. And those are scary correlations. Okay? Now, unless they could have, of course, made some errors, and I'll blame them for the errors. But if you take aside, those are saying that there is much more rigidity in the system than and that's good. I mean, just think what it would be like if we had to discover de novo all of these things. Okay? We would never be able to do it. The reason we are such fast learners, the reason we are such amazing learners, is because we are equipped to deal with this information in an efficient, simple way. If it weren't true, we wouldn't get anywhere. Well, wait a minute. Why can't we have a discussion?
2 quick questions. So the first one is for the amelics.
For
the last slide.
Yes, this slide. Yes.
Okay, so you show that you don't need to have hands to find this overlap. But did you look at the overlap between feet and tools?
Yes, I suggest you can speak tomorrow's presentation by Ella. Is it today or tomorrow? Yeah. Today or tomorrow? Tomorrow, where the details are there. The answer is that 3 out of 5 show the hand overlap, 1 out of 5 shows the foot overlap, or 2 out of 5 show the foot overlap. And then if you look at controls, 1 out of whatever controls also show a foot overlap. So it's not only the dysplasia subjects. Okay. Now, does this mean that experience doesn't play a role? Not at all. Okay, not at all. I'm not trying to say experience doesn't play a role. Please, don't interpret me saying that the experience plays a very important role. Okay, but it's at the margins. Okay, experience plays 2 roles. One is at the margins. This is where you're going to put stuff, and the other one is in terms of the content you put in there. Okay, And if you don't have experience, you don't know what content to put in there. But the content is not just random content. It's a content of a particular sort. And we have that content because our brains are organized to understand that kind of content. Okay? And there was this big debate in France between l'homme neuronal, comment s'appelle? L'homme neuronal. The fellow who wrote, Jean-Pierre Changeux. Changeux against someone else. And the question was, why is it, how do we get to have mathematical knowledge? Okay? And one argument was, the reason we have mathematical knowledge is because we are mathematical knowledge machines. Genetically, we are programmed to be able to have mathematical knowledge. And so what we are able to know, what we're able to represent, is precisely and only what we've been built up to be able to represent and know. Okay? And I don't know why anyone would put this into question, right? So given that premise, then the question is, well, what is this initial structure that gives rise to this? And how can it be manipulated? How can it be modified? And of course there are changes. Of course there is plasticity and so on. But the plasticity is extremely limited. The white matter tracks are there. They don't change. Okay? There may be some minor things, I don't know, but they're in place. And those white matter tracks are fundamental for communicating across areas. Okay? The functional connectivity depends crucially on the structure of those white matter tracks. Okay? So the fact that there is a structure is absolutely clear. Then the only question is, what is their nature? What is the content? And I've made a proposal. It's a very wild, loose proposal, I know. But it's a fun proposal.
We don't have time for your second question. I apologize. We're over time. So everyone can go have a drink, but first join me in thanking Alf for this talk.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow at 9.